And calls are mounting over the procurement of HIV/AIDS drugs from the African continent. This forms part of U.S. donors being asked to shift around 2 million antiretroviral patients to medicines made in Africa by 2030. African drug makers say this will boost the continent's production capacity and protect against future health security threats. Chairman of the Pharmaceuticals made in South Africa, Stavros Nicolaou, speaks to us about this. Thank you so much for your time. First, let's unpack the core issues around why this call has not materialized in the manner that was sought to be accelerated, as it's not a new one.
Firstly, thanks very much for having me on your program. And as you correctly point out, the issue of localization of pharmaceuticals is not a new one. It's one that's gained significant momentum, however, in recent times because of what we saw during COVID. So we saw during COVID that particularly with vaccines and other COVID-related, what we call medical countermeasures, Africa was at the back end of the queue. Unnecessary lives and livelihoods were lost. And consequently, this has put a new focus on Africa acquiring and attaining its own independence, pharmaceutical independence and supply security. Now, this has yielded some positive and tangible steps with regard to vaccines. And without getting into too much detail, we saw in December Gavi, which is a global alliance for vaccine initiatives and procures most of the vaccines for Africa, putting out a program for African localization called the Africa Vaccine Manufacturers Accelerator. So there are positive steps in the direction of vaccines. However, for other medical countermeasures, which include diagnostics, medical devices, test kits, so basic HIV tests, and of course the medicines, there's been very little progress in that regard. It does remain a priority, however, for both the African Union and Africa CDC. So off the back of last week's U.S. congressional visit to South Africa, part of that delegation was Dr. John Nkegasong, who's the head of PEPFAR. He's a friend of Africa. He was a previous Africa CDC director. This has presented a fresh opportunity, I think, to call for PEPFAR and other global agencies such as the Global Fund to start procuring, amongst other things, antiretrovirals and other HIV treatments from the continent, particularly given that Africa has almost 70% of the world's global HIV infection rate. But yet both PEPFAR and Global Fund are buying minuscule volumes from African producers.
Absolutely an opportune time for South Africa, given the closeness in relationship that it has with the global pharmaceutical landscape, to make this call and expedite it to see some sort of an implementation in the early stages. But the hurdles that are existing, and they are, of course, long-standing, Dr. Nicolaou. What exactly are the bottlenecks there? Could we say it's political will or the solidification of pharmaceutical relationships with the rest of the world are just not what we have seen with regards to certain agreements and relationships that South Africa has with the likes of the U.S.?
Look, I think there's very little, in my experience, political interference here. So I think any suggestions that there might be a souring of relations or anything like that, I don't think really comes into play with antiretrovirals. Remembering that PEPFAR largely buys HIV medicines, the focus is very much on HIV. So I certainly haven't picked up any sort of political souring that's gone on. I think that the political will is there. However, the execution and the capacity to execute is, I think, where we are lacking somewhat. And it almost requires, like what's happened with Gavi, it took 18 months of discussions, partly led by our own president and the African Union, to get us over the line on this one. So I think we would suggest a very similar process with PEPFAR, with Global Fund, We are going to be making, as African producers, overtures to both PEPFAR and also to the Global Fund to try and see how we can give fresh momentum to this. It's really almost inconceivable that we have almost 70% of the world's HIV infection rate on the continent, but yet we are importing most of these medicines, medical devices and diagnostics. It's really inconceivable. And I think what's really concerning here is that if there were to be another pandemic, as we experienced in 2020, and the world shuts its borders, there's no reason why that shutting of borders also can't apply to antiretrovirals or certain HIV medicines or diagnostics. So we need to be prepared, and certainly procuring drugs from African pharmaceutical companies in order to sustain these companies and give them longevity ought to be a priority. And then just very lastly, when you talk the world of merging public health and economic priorities, this is a classic example. So the continent can benefit economically, but more importantly, from a public health perspective and a health security perspective, it's really, really important that we get instant traction on this conversation.
As a parting shot, let me engage you on the latter part of your statement, the economics versus the public health provision of Africa, supplying drugs to the rest of the world and not only just the continent. How important is it for the rest of Africa not to lag behind the world in this regard? At this point, Dr. Nicolaou, if we are to be honest with the general public, Africa has not done so well in terms of being part of the bigger piece of the pie.
Look, I think Africa does lag, but certainly if I have a look at South Africa, I think there have been some, highly significant developments. And if I look at how our country excelled during COVID, whether it was clinical trials, the first to sequence the Beta and the Omicron variant, Aspen Pharmacare became the first company in the Southern Hemisphere on the African continent, albeit under contract manufacture, to produce a COVID-19 vaccine. Those are all significant developments. So certainly the potential exists in our country, as it does exist elsewhere on the continent, but it is, as I said, this is a classic case of you've got to get all the stars to align, regulatory harmonization, mutual recognition, and a redefining of the procurement mechanisms are two critical aspects to getting that momentum, and then we can certainly succeed. And just very lastly, manufacturing is all about economies of scale. And, what we are suggesting by way of a way forward is getting economies of scale so that South African and African manufacturers of pharmaceuticals can stand on their own 2 feet futuristically. They're not dependent on handouts, etc. But we need to get those economies of scale, which means get volumes in, and then we can compete, I believe, continentally, regionally, and globally.
Thank you so much for your input, Dr. Stavros Nicolaou, speaking to us on behalf of drug makers on the African continent. There is a call that the continent supplies drugs not only on African soil, but to the rest of the globe, in particular HIV/AIDS drugs.